درود به مردم شریف ایران. من شهر افشار هستم. خوش آمدید به یک برنامه دیگه Politics 365. امروز مجدداً یک مهمانی که در یه برنامه قبلی شرکت کرده بود، خانم پروفسور سحر عزیز، دعوت کردیم به برنامه‌مون. ایشون پروفسور قانون هستن در راتگرز یونیورسیتی در ایالت نیوجرسی و یک کتاب نوشتن به اسم The Racial Muslim که در آمازون میتونین بخرینش، بهش مراجعه کنین. به وبسایت ایشون هم میتونین مراجعه کنین، saharazizlaw.com. ایشون واقعا یه محقق و یک صاحب نظر و کارشناس واقعا تمام روابط آمریکا و اسرائیل و فلسطین و تاریخ فلسطین، مخصوصا حقوق بشر و موضوع حقوق بشر که الان در غزه داره اتفاق میفته. Sahar Aziz, welcome back to another segment of Politics 365. Thank you so much for joining us. We learned so much, and the last time we talked, we wanted to have you back to help us kind of through this difficult time as our nonpartisan, nonprofit educational platform seeks to do, is educate our listeners, especially our Iranian community worldwide, about what they're witnessing in the Middle East, and especially the anti-Semitism that we're all experiencing. You mentioned, we talked a little bit before, a lot of Iranians, when they came here in 79 during the hostage crisis, most people couldn't put Iran on a map, right? I mean, they could not tell Iran apart from Iraq. I personally was the subject of, some hate talk back before there was social media. I remember, I know people are listening to this on radio, but on the video, they can see my hair is very, very gray, but I was called a blackhead, as if, that was a bad thing. I thought it'd be pretty good if I have all black hair. When I was in my 20s, it was during the hostage crisis. It was during the Iran-Iraq war. The U.S. backed Iraq against Iran, hoping to, upend things. And really, since the late 70s, we've just seen a string of anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, anti-Middle East growth, and people seem to tolerate it in this country, in America, and it just, I find it the most un-American thing you can do to really put down a minority, whether you consider, technically they don't even consider us as brown or as, olive skinned or a minority in the legal context of American law. So we get no benefits of minority status, and it's been a big discussion in the Iranian American community. But we get all the vices, we get all the negative treatment, and especially with what's going on in Gaza in recent months, I think that there's been an uptick in anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim behavior. The FBI has reported widely on it. That's deeply troubling. Our children have to grow up in this country. We have to explain what's happening to them. And I think as parents, we all have a very tough time explaining the America that we love and what's come of it. It is not the America we thought it was if such anti-Muslim rhetoric is so prevalent and tolerated as just, that's, it's okay. So please educate us on your book and your thesis, so we can understand what's happening and hopefully be able to educate our kids as to how to prepare themselves for the future.
Well, thank you so much for hosting me again. And I'm excited to be in conversation with you about my book, which I'll show for those on video, called The Racial Muslim: When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I wrote the book after, at that time when I started writing it, 15 years of advocacy, litigation, media work, community organizing that I had been fully immersed in since 9/11, trying to defend the civil rights of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities who were all being homogenized as this monolithic national security threat. That unless you could individually prove to your friends, your family, your coworkers, your supervisors, or even your elected officials that you didn't support terrorism, the presumption was that you did, or that you sympathized with it. And that it was explicitly stated by many politicians that they believed Islam taught Muslims to be violent and taught Muslims to be hateful and to support politically motivated violence, which, as we know, is false. simply because there are non-state actors who engage in insurgencies, military operations, or terrorism does not mean that 1.8 billion people across the world who follow the religion of Islam support that. And so there was a complete depoliticization, decontextualization of the various types of political conflict that were going on in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, or in other Muslim majority countries. And the question that kept coming up while I was engaged again in this advocacy was how my fellow Americans could be so openly Islamophobic when all of us were taught in school that religious freedom is a fundamental American tenet, that the First Amendment was passed specifically to protect religious minorities from persecution and discrimination by religious majorities or by the state. But what I kept seeing was this complete normalization and acceptance of all forms of statements and actions that were clearly anti-Muslim. And that's what caused me to write the book. And my answer to that paradox is that Muslims have become racialized as these inferior people. And that instead of seeing Muslims as a religious minority of human beings that deserve equal dignity, equal rights, equal respect, that instead Muslims were actually experiencing what many other racial minorities had experienced in the United States, starting with the Native Americans who were nearly exterminated through settler colonialism and the founding of the United States, then Africans who were brought forcibly here to be enslaved for hundreds of years. And following that, you got numerous immigrants from China, from Asia, and other parts of the world, including Eastern and Southern Europeans who were Catholic and who were Jewish, who were also experiencing forms of racialization. So effectively, the idea of race, which is a social construct, it's not a biological fact, but it is what we call a master category in the critical race theory literature that allows society to develop around it hierarchies. And so in some societies, it's classism, it's tribalism, it's other forms of identity. But in the US, race is a master category. And what was happening is anyone who was Muslim was being raced as certainly non-white and certainly not equal. And then as a result, you experience racism. And therefore, whatever religious freedom rights you might have on paper, they really were not put into practice except in very narrow circumstances and only after very zealous litigation in courts where the facts were so clear that it was a violation of the law. So that's effectively what drew me to writing this book. And what I argue is there are four kind of master or macro factors that contribute to the racialization of Muslims. The first is white supremacy or white dominance, which affects, again, anyone who is not raced as white. And when I mean raced by white, that's not the same as the legal categories of whiteness, which is what you alluded to, because as you know, Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East is white on the US Census, which, by the way, and I talk about the Syrian Lebanese Christians who very zealously advocated the government, lobbied the government to be considered white and not Asian, which is what they were raced earlier in the late 19th century, because they wanted to be able to naturalize as US citizens. And if you weren't white, you couldn't naturalize as a US citizen and you couldn't immigrate because there were all of these anti-Asian, anti-Chinese immigration exclusion laws. So you have this white dominance or white supremacy, and then you have xenophobia, which is another fundamental kind of paradox of America where it needs immigrants, it wants immigrants, especially for its economy, but then there's always been anti-immigrant animus, especially against the newer waves of immigrants, and particularly when they're not from Europe. And then you have Orientalism, which was imported from Europe, and that is very unique to the experiences of people from the Middle East. And then finally, you have American empire or American imperialistic growth and hegemonic growth in Muslim majority countries, which really started in earnest after World War II. So when you analyze those four factors together, and effectively they kind of culminate in this horrific terrorist attack on 9/11, but also culminate into this toxic combination that then, what I argue, permanently entrenches anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia, or effectively the racialization of Muslims as the terrorist, dangerous, disloyal other.
Thank you for that explanation. It all makes perfect sense now that I look back at really my experience, my 40 plus years experience in America. All of those things come together. Sometimes I think, imagine a day without immigrants, right, in America. You take out how many corporations, take out how many economic, lifelines, take out social, cultural, artistic. This country wouldn't be what it is without immigrants. That's why it says what it says on the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, even though some presidents have tried to erase that and restart America or make America great again without immigrants, it sounds like. But the secret sauce of this country has always been the immigrants. That's why it has become what it is. But as soon as these international or global events happen, they draw a straight line between, let's say, one terrible wrong and say all 1.8 billion, you're all the same. And which is really funny, if I can say, if there's any part of this is funny. I mean, I always say, look, if you get two Iranians in a room, you get three different opinions, right? I mean, we're as different, as diverse as any part of this planet. There's no homogeneity at all. Of course, we may have a tangential line towards, cultural and religious backgrounds, but and geography, but we're just as different. We argue at the dinner table just like anybody else, moms, dads, sisters, brothers, uncles, everybody, the whole thing. But it's easy when it's difficult to look at the world and just look at a 10-minute soundbite on CNN and then paint everybody with the same brush. It's easy, right? This country is very good at that. I would love to know what the feedback or reaction has been to your book. Do you feel it's provocative? Do you feel it's challenging the norms? And some folks are pushing back and trying to write a different version of your analysis?
People, when they first hear the title, The Racial Muslim, their first response is, well, Muslims are not a race. And that is true, they are not a race, but they have been racialized. And when they take the time to actually read the book, they appreciate how the first half of the book provides the historical backdrop of the racialization of religious minorities as part of the American story, which were rarely told, or were told in silos. Okay, there was anti-Semitism, but nobody really looks at how anti-Semitism connects to Islamophobia and connects to anti-Catholicism and connects to anti-Black racism, because part of the basis for Protestant English settlers believing that enslaved Africans were inferior was because they were not Christian. Right? They saw their religions as no religions at all, or heathenism and evil. And also 30% of enslaved Africans are reported to have been Muslims from West Africa. So the first half of the book looks essentially at how it's not what you look like that races you, because that's the way we understand it in the contemporary era, is how dark your skin is, the texture of your hair, your facial features. But in fact, your religious identity has always been an additional trait that is used to determine, are you good or bad? Are you in the in group or the out group? Are you trustworthy? Are you assimilable? And so what happened in the early 20th century is that as more than 4 million Jews immigrated to the United States for economic reasons, but also for security reasons, because there were increasing anti-Semitic pogroms happening, particularly in Eastern Europe. And when they got here, they were considered inferior. They were considered less than, and they faced significant discrimination. And some of it was also theologically based, because the Klan was not just the Ku Klux Klan was not just Eastern European Jews as a threat to their white Protestant nationalist notions of what a real American is and what America should be. So they had their own Make America Great motto, which was Northwest European and Protestant. They also saw the Catholics, who were primarily Italian and to some extent also Irish, as a threat. And so when you study that history, you realize that Islamophobia is actually not that new. It's just that you have a new wave of immigrants, because it wasn't until 1965 that all of the immigration laws that excluded anyone who was Asian from either immigrating to the US or naturalizing to be a US citizen, or even coming to visit, they were all lifted, and the national origin quotas were lifted, which previously, from 1924 until 1965, these national origin quotas allowed only 2 to 3% of people to come from the various countries in Europe. And the census from which the 2 to 3% came from was the 1890 census, which is before the wave of Catholic and Jewish immigrants came. So this was intentionally passed to Protestantize and Northwest Europeanize the United States. In 1965, those quotas were lifted. And that's when you start to see the vast majority of people who are from the sub-Indian continent, from East Asia, from North Africa, from the Middle East, most of them came after 1965. And now their children and grandchildren are in college, and they're changing the politics. They're changing the conversations about Palestine. They're changing conversations about US foreign policy in the Middle East. And they're also joining with other minority groups and cross-racial coalitions, joining the Black Lives Matter movement and the Native American movement, because they've experienced in the post 9/11 world this racialized existence, where they're not in a country where people don't collectively punish them for what Al-Qaeda did or what ISIS did or whatever, terrorist organization in a Muslim majority country has done. And they constantly have to prove their loyalty, prove they belong, prove they love America. Meanwhile, you have the exponential growth of white nationalist groups who are engaging in all sorts of political violence, terrorism against the state, against minorities, whether they're killing people in synagogues of the Tree of Life, or whether they're killing Black people in churches, or even some of the mass shootings have been racially motivated. And they participated and executed an unprecedented attempted insurrection on January 6, 2021. Yeah. A direct assault on American democracy by trying to eliminate or invalidate the presidential election votes. So why didn't the government go and infiltrate all the churches, all the conservative political organizations? Why didn't they arrest all the white male conservatives in this country and spy on them and investigate them, as they did to many, many, thousands, tens of thousands of Muslims after 9/11, because of white privilege, because of white dominance? Because part of having white privilege is that you are presumed innocent, that you are judged by your individual actions, not the actions or bad actions of other people who share your identity. Yeah. That's one of the ways that racism manifests itself. So ultimately, what we all need to be cognizant of is that racism, unfortunately, is still a reality that we all need to work towards countering, and that it is not simply a black and white issue, and it's not simply an immigrant or non-immigrant issue, and that we're all in the same system that socializes us to privilege some groups over others, see other groups, some groups as innocent, others as guilty, and we need to be very conscious of those implicit and sometimes explicit biases.
Thank you so much, Professor Sahar Aziz, for joining us again. I really learned a lot. I feel like I was in your class. Please don't give me a quiz, but you know, I do know, I just want to say this, I do know racism is taught. Nobody's born racist. So that social generational passing of the torch that you mentioned, that you articulated, so true. I think as parents, we have a responsibility to teach tolerance to our kids, irrespective of their race or religion or where we are in geography or socioeconomic status. We have a responsibility to the next generation to leave them a more tolerant, a more peace-loving world than the one we inherited. That's our job as parents, right? And as thought leaders, as you are. So thank you so much, Professor Sahar Aziz. The book is The Racial Muslim. It's on Amazon, and there it is. It's Sahar AzizLaw.com. Please go get the book. It's a wonderful education in the America that we all live and love. Thank you so much.
Thank you.